Welcome, viewers, to Body Unified Flow. Here we simplify complexity and amplify performance. Today, we're diving into a massive and honestly often misunderstood economic force. We're tackling topic 3, understanding inflation, and specifically looking at how inflation diminishes purchasing power and causes fiscal deficits. We're going to unpack the dual threat of inflation. See, we often just think of inflation as prices creeping up at the grocery store, right? But it's actually a profound, invisible, mathematical force that fundamentally reshapes the relationship between you, the broader financial system, and the state itself. Okay, let's dive into this explainer. Here is our roadmap for today's explainer. We'll start with understanding inflation basics, then move right into the erosion of purchasing power, followed by the wealth transfer effect. After that, we'll examine the link between inflation and fiscal deficits before wrapping it all up with our summary and key takeaways. By the end of this session, our learning objectives are extremely clear. You're going to grasp the actual geometry behind price escalation, comfortably distinguish between real and nominal value, analyze how wealth literally transfers during inflationary periods, and evaluate something called the fiscal theory of the price level, or FTPL. Let's empower you with the framework to understand exactly what is happening to your money over time. To intuitively ground this mathematical erosion, let's just ask a simple everyday question. What actually happens to a specific amount of money, say 1,000 rupees, over a 30-year period? You've definitely noticed this in your own life. Think about Sharma Uncle's tea shop from our source examples. 10 years ago, a cup of tea might have been 2 rupees. Today, it's 6. Or consider that legendary 1 rupee college dosa that older generations are always talking about. There is literally no way you're getting anything for a single rupee today. And you know, that isn't some grand injustice. It is simply the natural consequence of inflation. Over time, the cost of maintaining a specific standard of living increases geometrically. Let's look at exactly how that math plays out. Now let's think about the geometric growth of living costs. Imagine an asset initially valued at $1,000. If we assume a constant, persistent 5% annual inflation rate, the math gets pretty wild. At 5%, the price of that exact same $1,000 asset nearly triples within 20 years, hitting over $2,600. Over 30 years, it increases more than 5-fold, reaching over $4,300. This brilliantly illustrates the silent erosion of purchasing power. If your investment return is exactly equal to the rate of inflation, you aren't actually growing your wealth at all. You are effectively stagnating. You're working harder just to remain in the exact same economic position. This brings us to a really crucial distinction: nominal value versus real value. Nominal value is simply the face value of the currency, literally just the number printed on the bill. Real value, however, is the actual volume of goods and services that specific unit of currency can command in the real world. While cash provides this comforting illusion of nominal stability, a 100 rupee note always says 100, right? It is mathematically flawed as a long-term storage mechanism. Why? Because saving in a traditional low-interest bank account or just stuffing cash under a mattress results in your wealth being systematically dismantled by inflation. The money doesn't physically disappear. The paper is still sitting right there, but its ability to actually buy you things simply evaporates into thin air. We can actually prove this erosion mathematically. To find the real value of your money, you take the nominal value, divide it by the price index, and then multiply by 100. Let's break that down into plain English. Say you get a 5% nominal wage raise this year. You probably feel a bit wealthier, but if the inflation rate for the year is 8%, your real wage has actually decreased by approximately 3%. Your purchasing power went down, even though your paycheck went up. This is exactly why economists always adjust nominal variables using a price index, like the Consumer Price Index, or CPI, to reflect what your true purchasing power actually is. Let's apply a famous mental model to this economic threat: the rule of 72. It's incredibly useful. If you divide 72 by the inflation rate, you can determine exactly how quickly your purchasing power will be cut completely in half. If inflation is at a moderate 3%, the value of your currency halves in about 24 years. But if inflation reaches 8%, the time it takes to lose exactly half of your purchasing power drops precipitously to just 9 years. Think about that for a second. Just 9 years to lose exactly half your wealth's utility if you aren't actively outpacing inflation. That is a staggering reality.
So what's causing all this? Well, contemporary economics maps out 3 structural vectors of inflation. First up is demand pull. This is liquidity-led. It happens when excess purchasing power is chasing a limited pool of assets. Think of massive stimulus checks putting extra cash in people's hands, which then bids up prices. Second is cost push, which comes from supply-side shocks. When critical non-labor inputs like energy, microchips, or construction materials suddenly face shortages, their prices spike, and those costs trickle right down to consumers. Finally, we have built-in inflation, which is also known as the wage price spiral. This is a highly persistent feedback loop. Workers demand higher nominal wages to combat past inflation, and then firms raise their prices to maintain profit margins, which just triggers yet another round of wage demands.
Let's pivot slightly and see how this builds from an individual problem to a massive state-level phenomenon. Inflation doesn't just eat away at value, it facilitates a massive redistribution of wealth. We call this the wealth transfer effect. Because debt contracts are almost always denominated in fixed nominal terms, inflation acts as a massive silent tax that shifts wealth directly from savers and creditors right over to borrowers and debtors. When you borrow money and inflation spikes, you get to repay that loan with currency that is worth significantly less in real terms than when you originally borrowed it. And who is the primary largest beneficiary of this inflation tax? The national government, which mathematically happens to be the absolute largest debtor in the economy.
But obviously, this wealth transfer isn't free. Markets adapt. This brings us to the Fisher equation, which shows that the nominal interest rate equals the real interest rate plus expected inflation. If inflation gets high and unpredictable, lenders aren't just going to sit back and lose money. They're going to demand a higher inflation risk premium. This immediately pushes up nominal interest rates across the board. So, while a borrower might benefit from a surprise burst of inflation today, their future borrowing costs, and the borrowing costs for both the private and public sectors as a whole, will aggressively increase.
This leads us to a highly sophisticated macroeconomic framework called the fiscal theory of the price level, or FTPL. Now, traditional models usually view inflation strictly as a monetary issue, printing too much money. But FTPL argues that inflation is actually a fiscal adjustment mechanism. This theory suggests that the price level adjusts to ensure the real value of the government's outstanding debt equals the net present value of its expected future primary surpluses. In simple terms, that's the gap between future tax revenues and government spending. If the public believes the government won't raise taxes or cut spending to eventually pay off its debt, the price level basically has to rise immediately. Inflation spikes to deflate the real value of that debt until it aligns with the government's perceived ability to pay. So, the relationship between inflation and the fiscal deficit is this constant, intense push and pull. Let's break down how this actually plays out. On the expenditure side, inflation is punishing. Rising nominal rates dramatically increase the cost of debt interest, which pushes the deficit up. Additionally, index spending, things like Social Security, pensions, or welfare programs, automatically increases with inflation, severely straining outlays. On the flip side, looking at revenue, an expanding nominal tax base might artificially boost receipts through bracket creep, but this is almost always offset by lags in tax collection. Finally, while the real debt value does decrease, providing a sort of soft default for the government, the overwhelming pressure on the expenditure side frequently exacerbates the overall deficit anyway.
Let's apply this to a practical case study: India's macroeconomic landscape for the 2025-2026 cycle. India is currently utilizing a really delicate fiscal strategy to balance growth and inflation. A major lever here is targeting effective capital expenditure at roughly 4.4% of GDP. By investing heavily in infrastructure like roads and railways, the state is aiming to reduce supply-side bottlenecks, which directly combats that cost-push inflation we discussed earlier. However, this is balanced against relentless fiscal pressure from indexed social safety nets. Programs like the Rural Jobs Guarantee, MGNREGA, and a looming implementation of the 8th Pay Commission represent indexed compensation that automatically swells during inflationary periods. It really showcases the intense struggle the state faces to maintain fiscal prudence.
We have covered an immense amount of ground today. Look at what you now understand. You've got a firm grip on the mathematical erosion of purchasing power. You can spot the illusion of nominal value from a mile away. You recognize how inflation acts as a massive hidden wealth transfer. And you've successfully decoded the complex fiscal inflation nexus, detailing exactly how the indexation of expenditures and rising debt service costs creates severe strains on government deficits. Which leaves us with this final provocative thought. Based on the sheer geometry of price escalation and the persistent nature of the fiscal inflation nexus, you really have to ask yourself, are you investing merely to grow extra wealth, or are you investing simply to survive the mathematical necessity of an inflationary world? Because understanding this shows us that investing is not just an offensive strategy. It is an absolute, non-negotiable defensive requirement to protect the future utility of your capital. For those of you who want to dive even deeper into these mechanics, here are the primary sources cited in today's explainer, ranging from IMF working papers all the way to Zerota varsity modules. Thank you so much for joining this Bodhi Unified Flow explainer. Keep learning, keep adapting, and we absolutely look forward to guiding you through our next deep dive. See you then.